So let me get going with the first panel then, and that is two of the people that I think are incredibly, incredibly wonderful in the whole urban planning, urban design realm, and they happen to be architects. The students of my class in this room know that I'm constantly bad-mouthing architects as being the evildoers, but these are two architects that I actually really like. So first up is Andres Duany. He's the founding principal of Duany, Plater, Zyberk and Company, incredibly well-known, almost needs no introduction, founder of, one of the founders of the Congress for the New Urbanism, and with his partner Liz Plater Zyberk designed Seaside, Florida, and many other hundreds of towns all over, and infill projects of all kinds all over the world. His book, Suburban Nation, is required reading in most of my classes and is the definitive source on what's wrong with the way urbanization in the US has been transpiring. And it's also one of the most best-selling urban planning books. Right after Jane Jacobs' Death and Life, you have Suburban Nation. So without further ado, I'd like to call these two fellows up. Andres, we're starting with you. Thank you.
It was wonderful actually to hear Ken Jackson. I've only heard him once before, but you know, he's one of my heroes. And he fulfilled all my expectations for that generation of scholarship, which is both a sort of big-hearted go at it from all points of view, including the scholarly, the research in the great libraries and the obscure basements of libraries, but also out there with anecdotes and having seen the places themselves. It was a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and I'd forgotten what open-mindedness is really like, you know. And the reason is that it has disappeared, and Emily, of course, is a later generation of scholar that actually is in which all ideas are contested, and there are different ways to within certain rules, one approaches ideas, and it is often very, very academic, lots of footnotes. Emily taught me what a footnote was. And I was assuming that this being an academic setting with Emily, having put the curriculum together, that it would bring up the current controversies. And so I prepared a presentation which assumes controversy, which in fact may not emerge at all. I should really be the last speaker. But I'm going to sort of outline what the controversy may be and then see what the resolution may be. Now, I must speak as a new urbanist, and that actually gives me the slack to actually be absolutely certain about everything. Because, you know, with a position known, what I should do is actually present to us what the position of this group is. And to this group, the new urbanism, the new urbanist, the neighborhood is completely fundamental. It occurs at the beginning of all of our documents. We spend a great deal of time defining it, and we understand and see the world with the neighborhood as a standard model from which things deviate. And insofar as they deviate, they get worse and don't work as well. So that's where I'm coming from. And I'm going to begin by a definition of the neighborhood. But before I do that, I'd like to show many, many diagrams. This is from our book, The New Civic Art, that has page after page after page on topics illustrated. And this is one probably of about 7 pages of the way that neighborhoods have been drawn. Now, the thing about drawing neighborhoods is that they're all constructs. And they're all essentially, from the turn of the century, last century, and this one, all the diagrams are about 100 years old. And this is because the neighborhood was immanent. It was natural law before that. No one had to protect it. It was like Emily said, it's the air we breathe. It's like love. Why even bring up the neighborhood when everybody lived in a neighborhood? And that is very much at the heart of the new urbanist definition of the neighborhood. What is a neighborhood to us? A neighborhood is above all defined by a pedestrian shed. That is what you can reach by walking. Okay? And what you can reach by walking becomes ever more interesting if you can get a very high correlation of people who walk. And conventionally, it has emerged throughout the 20th century that the 5-minute walk or the quarter mile is the gold standard. And a quarter mile is something so short that you actually never think of even getting in the car. It would just feel absurd. Now, some people say that when you have a meaningful destination like transit, like a transit station, you would easily, regardless of weather and hillside or whatever, you would walk half a mile. So we have 2 pedestrian sheds, the standard pedestrian shed of a quarter mile, in which you can statistically say the vast majority of people you can count on walking. Therefore, this shop will work and you don't have to provide parking and that kind of thing, or half a mile for transit. And that is our normative neighborhood. Now, everything else is a little flexible. Like, for example, neighborhoods may be villages in the landscape, standing free, or they may be agglomerations of villages in cities, and they may also have a great diversity in density. There are neighborhoods in New York that are 300 units to the acre, and there are perfectly good American neighborhoods in small towns that are 4 and 3 units to the acre. And this is very different from what a lot of people think. It's not, urbanism to us is not about density, because the density is driven by other things, sometimes called the market, sometimes called human happiness. Some people dream of living in Chicago, and some people dream of living in Phoenix, believe it or not, Emily. You know, a different thing. Some people dream of an apartment that has virtually a very small private realm and a magnificent public realm, and some people live, why do I need a public realm? All I need is parking and a yard. And that diversity is assumed by the new urbanist. So the density changes. What a neighborhood is useful for is as a measure, as a construct that allows us to measure that which is really, really important, which is diversity. If you're going to say they're going to be older and younger people, which usually implies poorer and richer people, if there are going to be shops for ordinary daily needs, if there's going to be workplace that is, let's say, theoretically balanced, if you're going to grow enough food, as in the Garden City model, that will actually complete a kind of self-sufficient area, then you need some measure, some bucket to put it in. And this is where the controversy comes in. We need the neighborhood in order to allocate the elements of urbanism administratively. We, the urbanists, do. The new urbanists do. Now, this sociological analysis actually says, the neighborhood doesn't exist. People habitually drive past the nearby store to go to the cheaper one. People are everywhere. The neighborhood has disappeared. And I thought that that would be the fundament of the discussion today, whether the neighborhood exists or whether the neighborhood actually works at the level of the city as a whole or at the level of the region. And by the way, what I'm not going to talk about is the overlay on this in which people actually think that, for example, the neighborhood structure is oppressive. Because, oh my God, you might be known by your neighbors. What privacy do you have if the streets are overlooked? Well, the other people say, well, that's why the kids can walk around safely. That's where the bonds of community are formed, precisely because you know your neighbor. Okay, that is an intractable discussion. I don't even understand how two planets can actually, two kinds of people can live in the same planet of that kind, but they do. So I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going to deal about what the new urbanists do well. And it behooves, it's important for me to remind some of you, because I had a conversation last night. People think the new urbanists have been actually innovative in terms of the physical design as architects and so forth. Like we've gotten somehow the houses and the frontages to work better, et cetera, et cetera. We actually haven't. The reason we're on the outs with the architecture schools is that they say, you guys aren't innovative at all. Look at what you do. Look at what it looks like. What we have innovated is not in the appliance. The appliance is the neighborhood. The appliance is the street. The appliance is, as we know, the square, the park, the alley, etc. What we have done is we've designed the plugs that have connected that appliance to the existing power grid. The entirety of the achievement of the new urbanism is taking the neighborhood and connecting it to the developers and the middle class they serve, the enormous American bureaucracy that administers it, the traffic engineers that can either support it or destroy it, to transit, to HUD, etc. We have actually marched through the power grids that create the cities and not designed the neighborhood, but designed the plugs, the diversity and variety of plugs that connect the neighborhood to the power grid. And that was early identified by Chris Alexander using exactly those words. He says, what you have achieved is you have not tinkered with the appliance, you've actually tinkered with the plugs that connect to the existing power grids. Now, what is the power grid that we've been dedicated to? The original power grid was the market. You know, Seaside and Company actually were very, very well liked. People loved to live where they could, you know, where they could be known by their neighbors and where their kids could walk and so forth. We know that drill. The second power grid was political. The third power grid was health. The fourth power grid coming up is actually the one we're working on now and what Doug does so very well, which is the environmental power grid. In the last few years, when I first started practicing and there was a table, there was a meeting, there was one person that was more important than any of the others. And literally they felt taller at the table. It's like they had a higher chair. And that was the traffic engineer. They wouldn't talk if they didn't want to. Whatever they said curtly and succinctly stood, and everybody else scrambled to fill it in. That has now been completely rebalanced, and the environmentalist on the table has the same attitude. You know, whatever little species decides, that's it, and there's no appeal. Now you work it all around. You work it all around the wetland, you work it all around this, etc. It's highly, highly regulated and legislated. There's very little creativity left in that kind of environmentalism because it's now embedded in legislation. It's very much like traffic engineering. So one of the things we've done, you know, and Doug has led this, is we have now, since I would say the first decade of the century, the new urbanists are dedicated to connecting this neighborhood technology, literally, with the environmentalist power grid. How do we talk to them so that they administer not only that which is outside the urban boundary, so that they not only safeguard nature, so that from their own point of view, they come in and administer the city. So it's a conditional response, it's a conditional surrender. What the new urbanists are saying, we will surrender the city to you, so long as you allow us to build the city. But if you come in only with the tools of nature, all you do is shrub up the city and actually prevent the city from happening, the walkability of the city, and you end up with essentially greenwash, something that looks green and has all the water being handled and all the buildings have sort of, you know, meshes on them and everything looks super green and all the measures. But in the end, because people walk less in all that green stuff, that literal green stuff, it's not environmental. So the transect, which is an environmental construct, is brought into the city, and what we're now trying to do is get the entire apparatus of the new urbanism to be seen from an environmental point of view. And so I bring this up. This is the slide I spoke about from a book that we prepared a long time ago. This is the typical new urbanist analysis. This is about 15 years ago, in which up there at the top are the various different names, the quartier of Leo Creer, the cell, which is used in Canada, the T&D, the TOD, the urban and the village, and so forth. And you see them on the upper bar. What they all have in common, and by the way, I consider these all the good guys. These are all the contracts. I travel all over the world, and whatever the name, people are talking about the same thing, which is within pedestrian sheds, you get diversity. Okay, you get the diversity of your daily needs. Not the special things like university and hospital, but your daily needs within walking distance. And of course, you know that that is basically a civil right. Okay, you must be able to live without a car. The assumption that you cannot live, that you will literally die, that you can't get a job, that you can't get decent food, that you can't get your kid to recreation, that you have no choice unless you have a car, is a fundamental social unfairness. And so within this is absolutely fundamental, and what we realize is that all the good guys, the four traditional ones on top, the village, the town, the city, the metropolis, and also the good guys of now, whether it be from England or Australia, all have in common certain overlaps, and the transect is the taxonomic engine that reconciles them. Okay, so what did we do? Here's the great diagrams of the conceptualizer Leo Creer, who says, well, here's the neighborhood, which is a village, and the neighborhood agglomerated becomes a city, and when you do not have the neighborhood, you actually get the suburb, right? And that you can actually, the city can grow large, or you can get a region of cities and neighborhoods. So why did the neighborhood disappear? A lot of planners talk about human scale, as just an ideal. It's not abstract at all. Human scale is what you can walk to, okay? And what you can walk to not only physically under duress, but comfortably. What's it like? And Leo Carrier's little diagrams of the quarter mile include an adult holding a little child by the hand. And the little child can walk the quarter mile, that little child has a life. And by the way, this isn't theoretical. If you look at one of our most complete communities, Kentlands, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary in a week, actually, the kids walk everywhere. It is exactly as advertised. So why did the neighborhood disappear when it's so fundamentally human? The car erased distance. Okay? Throughout all of history, okay, until the 19th century transportation inventions of the metro and the streetcar, you had to live in a neighborhood. It was the only urban pattern anywhere and across cultures. Beijing, Paris, Scandinavia, regardless of the weather, you had to walk to your daily needs. And then mechanical transportation at first actually extended it in a very intelligent way. The streetcar would stop periodically. And you can still see this in Connecticut Avenue in Washington, in which the neighborhoods actually are spaced by the loss of the streetcar. You can still see this in a kind of archaeology. In all of the cities, if you look for it, with the aerial photography, you will find an archaeology of neighborhoods. You will find the corner stores exactly as predicted. You will see it in the 1920s plans exactly as predicted. The quartiers of Paris are exactly the size of a neighborhood. It's an astonishing thing. All my life, I do aerial photography. I get the compass, I draw the circle, and I can find the neighborhood structure. But it was erased by transportation. Pretty late, when the car became normal and easy to accommodate, people simply drove by the nearby store to go to the cheaper one. They drove past the neighborhood restaurant to go to the one which actually gave you the variety and so forth. And gradually everything was scrambled. So now the current debate, the debate that may not emerge, but I'm going to bring up, is the neighborhood just an artificial and archaic construct? And is the city as a whole, which is to say, as far as the car will take you, really the new city? And that debate, maybe outside of here, is taking place in places like Harvard. And in many places, the neighborhood smells really bad, as a concept. No less than the porch and the picket fence. The neighborhood is a problem to people. Now, the neighborhood is what we use. We have these very succinct codes that wired in, that connected to the power grid of the 27,000 US planning departments, codes like this one, which are freeware. And we couldn't have written them if they weren't in a neighborhood, because the ideal of diversity needs a basket to put it in. It isn't just enough to say, oh, we sell enough hamburgers, we have enough people that make the hamburgers, we have enough people that buy the hamburgers, we have enough people that are the CEOs of hamburger joints. Because if you don't have the neighborhood, what they do is they disaggregate, and you get Houston. Or you get, for that matter, Detroit. In Houston, which has no coding, everybody has disaggregated. The rich people have the oak uplands, the poor people are in the X swamps. The industry is all where the great intersections are of the highway. They disaggregate because the automobiles permit that. So this is actually a critical stance to say we must have a neighborhood. The normal thing, paradoxically, is also the radical avant-garde one. We don't need the avant-garde to tell us the city as a whole is what works. That's what happens anyway when you don't have a code. The critical stance is to bring the neighborhood back, and our technology, including the smart code, the transect, and so forth, are based very deeply, deeply on the neighborhood, which is what you see there that's a typical smart code. So, in the attempt to make those who administer nature and those who administer cities have a common language, the great concept is the habitat. Now, the habitat, which is that actually species, animals, flora, fauna, minerals, and microclimate live together in a symbiotic relationship, wasn't always understood. This was actually conceptualized almost simultaneously in several places in the world, but principally in the United States and Germany. And it was the concept that actually that little bird really thrived with that little worm that really liked that little soil that actually became fertile with that particular degree of humidity. And the whole idea of the habitat was actually conceptualized around the turn of the century very clearly, and it was the most exciting idea since Darwin. Because before that time, people were just kind of discovering new species, ever smaller and more obscure, and putting them in taxonomic order. But when they said, no, no, there's a larger order of association, that was the hottest idea. And throughout the first 20, 30 years of the century, some of the brightest minds actually were dedicated to the idea of the habitat. Okay, like that. The neighborhood, of course, was still intact. So the fact that its currency, which was also diversity, within geographic limits, was actually also, that didn't have to be dealt with. But because this has disappeared, and this is powerful. By the way, this is the Clemens Park, and I'm going to speak about him shortly. You know, this is a habitat with the bird, the various plants in different degrees, climax conditions, succession, all these things that happen in cities. By the way, a climax condition in a woodland is analogous to a climax condition in a city in which the preservation order comes in. They said, we've matured enough, we look good, this is the exact, we now deserve stasis, let's protect it. So these analogies between environmentalism and cities, and by the way, one of the things about your program here, it's not going to get very far unless it integrates environmentalism. But also, if you were to integrate environmentalism, it would also be virtually unique in the nation. You could pioneer this. I'm talking about this as an idea that doesn't exist anywhere. Okay, so the idea of environmentalism, and as I said, not shrubbing up the city, but actually using the same technological tools to analyze and project both city and nature, both the urban and the natural, remains to be done. And the University of Chicago, being extraordinarily open-minded, may be able to actually achieve that. Okay, so these are the two guys that are very helpful. Frederick Edward Clemens, 1874-1945. He was the fellow out of the University of Nebraska who came up with the association theory. It's so normal now, isn't it, to think, of course the bird needs the worm, of course the worm needs the soil. You know, the spotted owl, this spotted owl needs that mouse needs that forest. You know, that was controversial in the 70s, but this came up, and this took the world by storm. This guy did. And he was the rock star of American environmentalism, and that park I showed you was named after him. This guy, and he wrote his dissertation around 1902, 1908, something like that. This guy, in the 20s, actually went out to the field and began actually looking at the species and doing things like quadrats and so forth and saying, where are the species actually happening? And he actually realized that the species are incredibly mobile. And they have huge habitats and huge ranges, and often they don't overlap. There's a small degree of overlap. And he came up with the individualist, the species individual theory, as opposed to species association theory. By the way, if you go to the literature, the two terms are not stabilized, even within the same article. But basically, we're speaking about something which is like a neighborhood in which you stay here, and then the analogy is that over here, that the species can go everywhere. He gave up on it. This guy was too dominant. Everybody gave up on him. He went on to do something else after writing 3 papers. And then this man died, and typical paradigm shift. By 1947, the debate was brought on. And there was a violent debate until 1959. Absolutely violent debate, one of the most exciting things ever. And I'm getting my information from a fellow called Michael Barber, who wrote an essay on this debate by actually interviewing the people who were there, the environmentalists who were there, what did it feel like, what, et cetera, from all over the world. And this man dies in 45. In 47, the old papers are revived. There's a huge debate, and this guy wins. And the species are allowed, because science, empirical analysis, is they're all over the map. But you know how it was resolved? It was resolved, and this is the text from Michael Barber. I might actually, because I have 5 minutes, I'll read it. In 1917 and again in 1926 and 39, Gleason published his theory of vegetation, which he called the individualistic concept. This is the one in which the individual spread all over the city or the map. According to this theory, formations and associations are not real. Formations and associations was Clemens. The habitat are not real. Are not real. Real natural units. They are merely artifacts of human constructs or abstractions. Groups of species do not appear and rise and fall in abundance synchronously, which is succession and climax, but across the landscape. Entire collections of co-occurring species are not interdependent. Rather, each species spreads out as an independent entity, individualistically distributed according to its own genetic, physiological, and life cycle characteristics, and according to its way of relating both to the physical environment and the other species. How does this sound like American individualism now? I mean, this should be humans. Rather, each species spreads out as an independent entity, individualistic. Ken Jackson spoke about that, about the kids going everywhere. You go to the neighborhood and the kids go here, the kids go there, the guys with the blue hair go there, the guys with the white hair go there, and so forth. Spreads all over. It's exactly the same. It's unbelievably analogous. So how was it resolved? And I'm not going to read this here, but the way it was resolved, in a really grown-up way, they said, we need both theories. One theory will be followed by the scientists, which is the one that we will actually get the empirical information that people and species are all over the map. But we can't administer this. We can't administer an environmentalism in which a developer can arrive at a place where there's a bunch of rare and endangered turtles and actually pull them out of their burrows, put them in a pickup truck, and dump them, put them somewhere else. Which in fact you physically can. And they will survive, because you can find another habitat. But they can't administer this, what a mess. So surreptitiously, with incredible maturity, the environmental movement actually says we are operating both theories. And one of the things I find, actually, when I find confusion anywhere, is that there are people who are administering things that actually don't understand. They're actually trying to apply science, when in fact what we're doing is administrative convenience, or they're trying to do administrative convenience when actually the science says something else. I run across this confusion, and I always give them the article by Michael Barber and said, this is the source of your confusion. And so I would say that actually we need both theories. If there is to be a debate, it'll probably be at that level. This is the kind of debate that I think is being had in a more hostile academic world. But if there is to be a debate, I think it needs to be solved two ways. We who administer in a critical way the city through the planning departments do need the existence of the neighborhood as a construct, because it is actually the fundamental human habitat. We believe temporarily destroyed by cheap fuel and the proliferation of automobiles. But those who do science and actually see the blue-haired and the white-haired segregate actually should also do what they do. And we should, within the academy, get to know each other, but let's not have a public debate and confuse the people, because the people have a lot of say, and they actually need one or another construct. Thank you.